So we closed the last video by making a point about the method that Thompson deploys. She relies on something like intuitions or default judgments about cases. So for example, when you're presented with the trolley driver case, your default judgment or intuition is that it's morally permissible for the driver to make the switch or the bystander to make the switch. And when you're presented with the super surgeon case or the sloppy surgeon case, your default judgment or intuition is that it's not morally permissible for the surgeon at issue to make the switch. So what Thompson does is she says, look, here's our intuitions. We should take our intuitions seriously. And then she tries to find a moral principle, what ends up being her modified version of the descend out of the blue principle. She tries to find a moral principle that fits with our intuitions. Well, that methodology presupposes that our intuitions are getting cases correct. After all, if they're not getting cases correct, why bother finding a principle that fits with them? Why think it's revelatory of what morality is really like? Kant, of course, follows this same procedure. Remember when we went through building Kant's theory, we started by looking at his intuitions about a series of cases, or the intuitions he thinks all of us share about a series of cases, and then he tried to find a moral principle or a way of thinking about morality that fit with those intuitions. Now, what we'll look at now is a challenge to that methodology that comes from a philosopher, also a psychologist named Joshua Green. And here's Green's central thesis. Moral judgments in response to violations familiar to our primate ancestors, you can call these personal violations. These are things like a surgeon harvesting someone's organs, like literally physically getting in there and assaulting someone. Those kinds of moral judgments are driven by social emotional responses, while moral judgments in response to distinctively human, impersonal, unfamiliar to our primate ancestors moral violations, and that's like, you're in a trolley going down the tracks and the brake is broken, or you can pull a switch which will cause a train to switch tracks and kill somebody. That's sort of an impersonal act, whereas the surgeon is like, say, stabbing and carving the heart out of the healthy patient. The trolley driver or the bystander are just pulling a switch. So those kinds of moral judgments, those made in response to these sort of impersonal moral violations, are more cognitive and less emotional. That's Green's idea. Now, you can think of the point like this. There's emotion on the one hand and there's reason on the other, and these are two distinct things. Reason dictates utilitarian decisions. So when you're using reason, you're going to come to the kind of conclusions that Mill would come to. You're going to say, pull the switch to save the one, to kill the one to save the five. But you're also going to say, harvest the organs from the one to save the five. And when emotion wins out, you're going to make more Kantian decisions. You're going to say things like, don't harvest the organs to save the five, because it's wrong to kill the one, because that's feels very personal to you, the killing of the one. But when it comes to a case like pulling the switch, it will feel impersonal, and thus emotion won't come into play, and thus you'll follow Mill and say choose the five over the one. So whether our judgments sort of go a more Kantian way or a more Millian way depends on whether emotion or reason wins. That's the idea. So let's sort of set this out a little more clearly. We have two theses. One is that responses to violations that are familiar to our primate ancestors, these are the personal violations, are driven more by emotion than by reason. And two is that responses to violations that aren't familiar to our primate ancestors, these are the impersonal violations, are driven more by reason than by emotion. Why does that matter? Well, the idea is that thesis one explains why we have the intuitions we do about the surgeon. That is, that the surgeon shouldn't harvest the healthy organs. Why? Because this psychological feature of us, our emotion, gives us sort of a strong negative reaction to thinking about causing that kind of harm that's familiar to our primate ancestors. Whereas thesis two explains why we intuit that we should pull the switch, because it's a very impersonal violation. It's not familiar to our primate ancestors, so we don't have ready-made emotions to drive our thinking, so we then use reason, and that's when Mill wins out. Now, theses 1 and 2 are theses about our psychology. They're not theses about the moral truths. So the idea goes, our intuitions about these cases, why we judge as we do in these cases, is best explained by this kind of reason, emotion, psychological fact about us, rather than by any sort of underlying theory we might have that intuitions are tracking. So on this view, the whole project that Thompson engages in, and for that matter, that Kant engages in, of trying to find moral principles that fit with our intuitions is misguided, because those intuitions aren't revealing some underlying facts about our nature. that is about a theory of morality that stems from our nature. They're not really revealing some underlying theory like a theory of universal grammar, but one about morality. They're just revealing sort of brute psychological facts about what drives our judgments in particular kinds of cases. So why should we accept these theses? I'm not going to look at all aspects of Green's view. I'm just going to run through sort of one aspect, one experiment, and you can think about what you make of it. So you put subjects in a scanner. You do magnetic resonance imaging in real time, so you can sort of see what's going on in the brain. It's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that allows you to see what's going on in the brain. There's a very complex and important story there that places severe limits on what you actually see. But let's just set that aside and presume that we're seeing what's going on in the brain. So we give them 3 types of moral dilemmas while they're in the scanner. So type 1 are amoral. Sorry, I shouldn't say 3 types of moral dilemmas, 3 types of dilemmas. Type 1s are dilemmas that don't have anything to do with morality. So it might be like, I don't know, like you want to go to some concert, but if you go to the concert, then you can't go to your favorite restaurant or something, and you have to decide which to do. Then there are moral dilemmas that are impersonal. And that's like the trolley driver case and the bystander at the switch case and a whole series of cases where you're not sort of directly physically causing anybody harm. Instead, you're performing some action that produces a sequence of events that leads to someone being harmed. But it's an impersonal kind of harm. Next are the personal moral violations. These are where you're directly physically causing somebody harm, like you're harvesting their organs or pushing them off a bridge or something along those lines. And what Green predicts is that brain areas associated with emotion will be especially active during the personal moral dilemmas and not during the impersonal moral dilemmas. And what he further predicts is that there'll be a kind of interference effect. And what that means in this case is this. And I'll say more about what interference effects in general are momentarily, but in this case, what it means is this. If you're the sort of person who's inclined to say that in the transplant case or the large man case, you should, in fact, harvest the organs from the healthy patient, or you should push the large man to save the 5, then you're going to take longer to do that than will people who will people who say you shouldn't harvest the organs and shouldn't push the large man. And the reason you'll take longer, the idea goes, is that your emotions are getting in the way. They're telling you to say, no, don't harvest the organs, and no, don't push the man. But you have to sort of overcome that. There's an interference between emotion that reason has to overcome, so you'll take longer because reason has to overcome that interference. This is a familiar kind of psychological study you're maybe familiar with, but in case anybody isn't, so suppose I give you a series of shapes and I ask you to name their color. So you say that's blue, you say that's red, and now I give you a series of words and ask you to do the same thing. So you say red for this word. For this next word, you're supposed to say blue. For this next word, you're supposed to say, you say yellow for that shape. For this next word, you're supposed to say yellow. Well, the idea is when you see green written in yellow, there's going to be some interference that's going to slow you down because you're going to want to say green because the word says green. You're going to want to sort of, your brain sort of automatically reading the word is telling you to say green. So in order to say yellow, you're going to have to overcome that urge to say green. So when you see the color red written in blue, you'll be slower to say red, and you might even sometimes say blue, than you would be if the word blue had been written in blue or in black, some neutral color. And you can see how this would play out for a variety of colors. And the idea is it's an interference effect. And how is that relevant? Well, as I said, the idea is that when subjects who show longer reaction times for trials in which their response doesn't fit with the sort of natural emotional response, so you don't have a strong you have a strong emotional aversion to saying that some personal violation is morally permissible, but you say it anyway. So you say harvesting the organs is morally permissible. Subjects will take longer to do that because there'll be interference from emotion. So the concrete prediction is that the rare person who judges a personal violation to be morally permissible will take longer than other subjects in making that judgment. But the person won't show similar delay in making judgments about amoral or impersonal dilemmas, which suggests that even for them, emotion is telling them, look, don't accept these personal moral violations. They just overcome it to be kind of consistent. Okay, so What are the results? Well, that's exactly what found. Brain areas associated with emotion are more active during personal moral dilemmas, and there is appropriate interference. So what's the conclusion that Green draws? I'm going to skip over this stuff on experiment 2 and just sort of set this out. So here's the idea. Let's just remind you that thesis 1 here is supposed to explain why we have the intuitions we do about the surgeon case, and thesis 2 is supposed to explain why we have the intuitions we do about the trolley case. And since these theses don't appeal to anything like us tracking an underlying theory akin to a universal grammar, they just appeal to sort of which cognitive mechanism is pushing our response in this case. It looks like, says Green, psychological facts about our intuitions explain our intuitions rather than some claim like there's an underlying theory that the intuitions are revelatory of. So how does this play out? Well, think again about what Thompson does, and for that matter, what Kant does. Thompson seeks moral principles that capture our intuitions, and she then infers that those principles are true because they best explain our intuitions. And what Green is saying is, no, there's a better explanation of our intuitions. And the better explanation of our intuition is that there's kind of a brute psychological fact. When personal moral violations are at issue, emotion gets into play. When impersonal moral violations are at issue, emotion doesn't get into play. And that's what best explains our intuitions. Now, there's a lot to be said about Green's take on this issue. You might think, for example, that our underlying moral theory inheres in reason and in emotion. So these different centers, reason centers and emotion centers, are playing the role they're playing to sort of reveal the theory. And consequently, rather than showing intuitions don't have significance in revealing moral truth, what Green shows is how it is that intuitions operate in the brain. That is how it is they manage to show the moral truth. There's also the possibility that there isn't a sharp reason-emotion divide that Green is supposing, and that if you have things straight, you can see that both responses are in some ways emotional and in some ways rational. There's all sorts of possible replies to Green's view. I just wanted to get it on the table so you can see it as an alternative to the Kantian and Thompsonian method of identifying moral principles. Okay, we'll stop there.